What we're going to talk about today are military genealogy resources that are available online. Normally when I give this lecture, it's on using both in-house records at libraries, archives, museums, and then some online resources to fill in the gaps. But since we're all sheltering in place and we don't have access to those primary resources, I want to walk you through the types of resources and places where you can go to find some of these things online. We've got a couple of polls for you. I'm going to have Kara launch the first one for me, and it's just asking what types of military engagements have your ancestors served in as you've been doing your research. So we'll give you a few seconds. We'll let you go ahead and select as many as you want, so we can keep track of, the kinds of things that you're interested in learning about today. So go ahead and choose what you would like. We'll give it another, I'll give you 10 more seconds. And then we'll go ahead and we'll shut down the poll in just a few seconds. So I see a lot of World War II. That's kind of exciting. Revolutionary War, we'll definitely talk about those. Okay, so we're going to close our polling if you've all had the opportunity to do that. And then we're going to share the results with you. Virtually everybody who is on today has a World War II veteran in their families. It's nice to see really a wide display. I mean, I usually don't get a lot of Spanish-American War or War of 1812, so this is kind of exciting. So I'm going to give you resources that are going to talk about each one of those things. So first, before we get started right there, jumping right into the Revolutionary War, I want to talk about the types of resources that exist, and I want to talk about the types of places where you're going to go to find those things. So what are you looking for? So the types of things that you're going to look for when you're researching your veteran are things like enlistment papers, separation papers. They're entering and they're leaving the service. You're going to look for things like soldier and regimental lists, muster rolls, things that are going to show them as part of a unit or a division. If they stayed in the military long enough or had received a pension record, that could arrive on both the federal level or on the state level. There were some states that did offer pensions to their soldiers or their widows or their children if they had died in military service. Military service organizations is a resource that is often overlooked. So things like the VFW, the American Legion, and then if you go back further, things like the Grand Army of the Republic, Sons of Union Veterans, Sons of Confederate Veterans. So things like that, those types of military service organizations can provide a lot of insight as well. Things like general county histories. We're pretty familiar with those county histories that came out in the late 19th century that were promoting a lot of Civil War soldiers and Civil War units. But people are still producing county histories today. So you might find there were a lot that were done in the 1920s that referenced First World War soldiers. There were some that were done after the Second World War that were highlighting soldiers who had served and sailors who had served in the Second World War. So there are options out there for you. War histories, things like Ken Burns' The War, things like that, that are going to talk about what the experience was like from the grunt soldier all the way up to, administrative staff. So war histories give you a nice overview of the types of things that are going on. But then there are things that are called war diaries. And the war diaries are the types of things that would be kept by the company clerk. Think of Radar O'Reilly. The company clerk would keep what's called a war diary. And the diary would be a list of every transaction for that particular unit throughout the course of the war. Every place they went, everybody who was in that unit, their supplies coming and going when they needed to be reinforced, all of that stuff would get written down in a war diary. So a lot of people think when you say war diaries, you mean an individual soldier's personal account. No. A war diary is something that's kept by the unit clerk. So, those you can find online in some places too, excuse me, and those can provide a lot of insight for you. So where am I going to go to look for these types of things? Anytime you're doing any type of research, you really want to start locally. So you want to check with the local library, your local library. You're logged on today, so you're listening to me talk about these types of resources, but think about the communities that your soldiers lived in, your sailors lived in, your nurses lived in. Do they have online databases that might have, a list of soldiers? Do they have diaries and letters about, what life was like for those soldiers during the Civil War, Revolutionary War, World War I, whatever it happens to be? I can guarantee your local library, genealogical, or historical society is going to have newspapers or newspaper collections that you're going to be able to use to fill in those gaps a little bit about their military service. A lot of them will have photos. If they don't have photos of individual soldiers, they might have full photos of things like VFW parades and picnics, where you're going to get a group of soldiers who are going to be listed, who might be named on the back of those particular items. But once you've looked locally, you want to look locally every place that that soldier has lived. So for example, if you had a soldier who had enlisted in the city of Chicago, had served from Chicago, but then moved to Kansas City, and then eventually moved to Denver, I would be looking in Kansas City and I would be looking in Denver too, because maybe they joined their local VFW and they're in a photo in the library in Kansas City. Or maybe when they died, they were buried in a national cemetery in Colorado, and there might be records at the local library on them buried, in that cemetery in Colorado. So any place that they've gone, you want to follow that path and you want to check those local resources as well to see if they have more information. But then let's move up the food chain a little bit. State libraries, state archives have a lot of materials about the soldiers, sailors, and nurses who had served from their own communities. So beyond just the National Guard, beyond just the individual state militia units that might have, been drafted or had been called up and federalized, they're going to have records that are different from what you find on the federal level. So what we have at the Illinois State Archives, and I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about the First World War, but Illinois has an adjutant general, and every state has one, and the adjutant general is responsible for the military units represented from their home state. And the paperwork that is collected on the adjutant general's level is different than what is collected by the federal level. So it's always worth it to contact your state library or your state archives to see what types of materials might be available. That might be even available digitally as well. I know Michigan State Archives has done a fantastic job of making military records available digitally. Our Illinois State Archives as well have muster rolls for the Civil War available. They've got some indexes and inventories to military units from the Black Hawk War all the way up to the First World War. So there are some places to look online to investigate what your state might have before you start moving up that food chain. So you've looked at your local library, you've looked at your state library. How about the Library of Congress? The Library of Congress, people have a tendency to forget that they are a public library. They are the nation's library. And they have a lot of resources that are going to be available for you when you're researching your military ancestors. So the obvious would be the Veterans Oral History Project. So that is sponsored by the Library of Congress, and that has been ongoing for over a decade. So they collect stories from individuals, whether that's a video recording, whether that's a sound recording, whether that's personal papers, letters, diaries, photographs, and they tell the story of what the war was like from the individual soldier's perspective. So you're not getting that top-down history that we're so used to. You're kind of getting that history from individuals' eyes. And what's so great about the Veterans Oral History Project is that you can search it in a number of ways. You can search for an individual soldier or sailor or nurse, but you can also search by unit. You can search by location. There's a lot of search features in there that people have a tendency to overlook. And why is this important? Because you don't serve in a vacuum. When you serve in the military, you're serving usually with people from your own community. You have buddies, you have friends, maybe your brother or your cousin is also in the service. And these oral histories really do a very good job of learning about those connections. So somebody might talk about their buddy Bobby, who just might be your relative, who's referenced in somebody else's oral history project. So it's a great collection that's available through the Library of Congress. A couple of other really good collections worth noting if you're doing military research. They have Chronicling America, which is a national newspaper database, which includes things like during the First World War, Great Lakes Naval Centers, camp newspaper. They've got newspapers from the early 18th century up into the 20th century. So Chronicling America is also a great resource to find out more about the war, about the unit or the division that your ancestor might have served, and potentially, if you're lucky, about your ancestor individually as well. Now, one of my favorite things about the Library of Congress is their map collection. They have an absolutely astounding map collection. So while the Library of Congress in person has over 15 million maps accessible to you, you still have almost 30,000 of them digitized and available to you from home. So they have a fantastic collection of Revolutionary War maps, of Civil War maps, of World War II and World War I maps available on their website for you to utilize in your research. And why is this important? Because even if you didn't have an ancestor who served in the American Revolutionary War, but you had an ancestor who lived near Concord, or who lived near Williamsburg, they saw battle on the ground across their own properties. So even if they didn't serve, they're still going to be impacted by the war, and they're still going to potentially be represented in this map collection that's available online. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, or if you just want to jot it down, if you go to the Library of Congress, if you go to loc.gov, you're going to be able to find these collections. But then they also have specific military topics as well. So whether you're researching the Revolutionary War, the Korean War, World War II, Civil War, there's going to be military topics as well, which is going to take you to their digital collections, which is going to show you the types of resources that they have available to you from home. So the National Archives, I would be remiss if I didn't spend time talking for just a couple of minutes about the things that the National Archives has available to you. So the National Archives has over 50 branches across the United States. So whether it's from Hawaii and Alaska to Washington, D.C., they're going to have regional archives and national archives that are going to be able to help you with your military research. So the two main archives in the Washington, D.C. area is you have Archives 1, which is the one we think of that has the Declaration and the Constitution. It's the one right in downtown Washington, D.C. They have records about stateside units, and they have records about Revolutionary War up to 1912. So if you're doing research on Civil War veterans, if you're doing research on Spanish-American War veterans, you're going to go through the National Archives in Washington, D.C. If you're looking for soldiers or sailors who served from 1912 to the present, then those records are going to be in St. Louis. They're going to be at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. So National Archives has records on units and bases and camps after 1912, but not about individual personal soldiers. So if I'm looking for information about the 313th Engineers, I'm going to go to DC. But if I'm looking for information on Ira Jones, who was in the 313th Engineers, I'm going to go to St. Louis. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a little bit. But then there's also Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. So if you're doing First World War, Second World War, Korean, Vietnam era research, you're going to go to Archives 2 in College Park. That's the records that they have for the more modern military engagements. This is also where they have First World War records for those who were in the AEF. So if you were in the American Expeditionary Forces and you went overseas to France or to the Canal Zone, then those records are at Archives 2 in College Park. So if you were stateside and you were at Fort Dix and went overseas, your stateside records are in DC at Archives 1. Your overseas records in France are at College Park at Archives 2. And I know it's very confusing, but it'll just help you understand where you're going to go and who you're going to contact for those types of records. So there are forms online. Somebody had already put a question in about if I don't know the exact dates of military service, but I believe they were in the Second World War, how do I fill out that form? Exactly the way you did. You're going to put in everything that you know about an individual, their date of birth, their name, their date of death, who their parents are, where they may have served. We have a tendency to think that names are unique. I'll give you an example. My grandpa, his name was Casimir Tatera. It was C-A-S-M-E-R. There wasn't an I in it. He was not Casimir. He was Casimir. And the fun thing is there were actually two Casimir Tateras who had served in the Second World War, mine from Chicago and another one who served from Connecticut. So no matter how unique you think your name might be, there might be somebody else with the same name. So the more information you can give, their date of death, their date of birth, their social security number, if you have it, that's what they're going to use to locate them. So you don't need to be too worried about whether it was Second World War or Korea, or maybe it was in between. As close as you can get will serve its point. And those forms, if you wanted to request and mail those in from home, here's the link, and this is in your handout, that has all of these different web addresses so you can dig deeper into the collections that the National Archives has to offer. So now let's talk about actual military engagements and the types of records that exist from the Revolutionary War up until the time that we reach. I'll end with Korean War, Vietnam War. So you're going to hear me reference, quote unquote, the big three quite a bit over the course of the next 45 minutes. So I'm going to talk about ancestry, I'm going to talk about fold 3, I'm going to talk about family search, because each one of those are going to have different pieces of the puzzle when you're trying to tell your veterans' history and you're trying to tell their war service and their experience. So for the Revolutionary War, I can't give you all of them because there are hundreds of sites out there for the Revolutionary War, but I'm going to highlight some that I think are really useful and are going to really offer a good place to start if you haven't done this research before. So Cindy's List, if you're familiar with it, is a site that is like a web portal. It's like an aggregator. So what she does is she scours the internet and collects genealogy sites by topic. So whether I'm looking for railroad records or whether I'm looking for First World War records, or maybe I'm looking for Schenectady records, I could go to cindyslist.com and choose what my topic is. And then she's going to give me a page full of links to other resources. So if you're just trying to get an idea of what exists and what's out there, it doesn't hurt to browse through Cindy's list to see what she might have on a particular topic. So if you went and looked at her American Revolutionary War list of topics, you would see ancestry listed there. You would see Daughters of the American Revolution listed there. You would see Tennessee Paths listed there. So she kind of pulls all those sites together in one spot. The only thing that frustrates me with Cindy's list is I have a tendency to get lost. So I'll be 4 clicks in, you know, oh, that looks good. Oh, that looks good. And then I can't remember how I got there. So I have a tendency to get lost because there's such a vast amount of research that's available in there for you that it's very easy to get down the rabbit hole and forget how you got there. No American Revolutionary War researcher is going to be able to do their job efficiently or effectively without visiting the Daughters of the American Revolution. Whether you're going to visit the DAR in person at their library, which is absolutely exquisite, I'll come back to the library in just a couple of minutes, or whether you're doing your research online, you really, really, really need to take advantage of the online digital resources that the Daughters of the American Revolution have available to you. So the two most useful is they have 2 online databases. One is for searching your Patriot ancestor. So I would be looking for Jeremiah Evans, and I would put his name in, and I would be able to see all the Jeremiah Evanses and where they've served and a little bit of information about them. But they also have a database of ancestors. So if I'm researching, I have a Revolutionary War ancestor and I can become a member of the DAR, and I'm researching my family tree backwards, I can search on an ancestor. So if I know that the story is that I had a great aunt who had become a member of the DAR, I can look for her. And if I can find her application, I can buy it for $10, and it'll show me all of the resources and all of the research she did in order to prove her connection to the Patriot in order to become a member of the DAR. So in a lot of instances, I don't have to connect all the way back to the Patriot. I only have to connect to the nearest ancestor who has filed an application to become a member of the DAR. So this is a great resource, and it's also really useful even if I have no Revolutionary War ancestors whatsoever. It's really, really useful for finding those women who are born and live from the Revolutionary War until the first ever named census in 1850, because a lot of them are close enough that they are mentioned in this ancestor search in the Patriots collection. So I can find a lot of women who fall out of my tree because they marry or remarry. I can find them referenced in DAR applications. So the DAR is an absolute imperative if you're going to do Revolutionary War research. Family Search has some collections. I'm not going to talk about the catalog because I'm not going to have the time to drill deeper into that. But there are some every name indexes that are available through the research page at familysearch.org. And one of them is the Revolutionary War compiled service records. So you would be able to go in and do a search by name of a particular ancestor and be able to find a little bit more information about them. If they had received a bounty for their service, those application files are in there as well, which kind of rolls me into the the resource just below it. So Kentucky Revolutionary War Warrant Database. So what this is a collection of names of people who had turned in a warrant to collect military land. So if you had served in the Revolutionary War, in your handout, there is a breakdown of how much land you would get based on what your rank was. So you would get everything from 1,000 acres to 100 acres, from being a general down to being a lieutenant. So what if you didn't want to go to Kentucky or Tennessee, or you didn't want to go to Ohio? Then you had the luxury to either sell or trade or give away, or even lose in a card game, you know, or to give it to a nice young lady that you had met the evening before. The person who turns in the warrant isn't necessarily always the person who was awarded the warrant. So if you were to search a database like this and you didn't see your soldier, it doesn't mean that your soldier didn't serve. It just means that they might not have wanted to move to Kentucky and take the land, you know, west of the Cumberland Gap. So, you know, these databases are great, but you also have to keep in mind what was going on at the time. Not everybody wanted to go. So they're useful, and you might even find some people who hadn't served, but who had been willing to move further west, show up in these databases. And it would have the name of the person to whom it was issued, but then on the back side, it would be the name of the person who redeemed it.
Tina?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind answering a quick question. Somebody asked, what is SF-180?
That is the form. If you're not filling out the eVetRex form on the National Archives site live, so if you go to archives.gov and you click on military resources, you can apply for a copy of a service record right online. You have to be next of kin though, which means you have to be unremarried widow, sibling, child, or parent. You can't be a niece or nephew. You can't be a grandchild. If you are one of those who are next of kin, you can file the form online. If you are one of those other family members, you would fill out the SF-180 and request a copy of the form. So you could do it. It's the same premise. You're still putting all of the information in. It's just if you're not next of kin, you would use the SF-180 and you would mail it in and you would wait for your response. Whereas if you did it online, then it would immediately, you still have to print something out and sign it so they know you're a real human being, but it speeds up the process a little bit. And the SF-180 can actually be used for other military engagements instead of just modern records. So it's a really useful form if you're looking for military service records.
Tina? Sorry, it was kind of warbly there, the sound. I don't know if it's the headset.
Oh, I don't have it in today. Maybe I should put it in today. So the SF-180 is the form that you would fill out if you're not next of kin. And it's the form that you would fill out if you were looking for older military records than those that are 1912 to the present. If you're next of kin and it's a modern record, you can apply online. That's the form you would use if it was an older record or if you weren't next of kin. Does that help answer the question?
Tina, there's a follow-up question, but do you want to put your headset on? We'll try that just for a moment to see if that helps. And then I'll read you the next question. If you guys could just bear with us for just a moment, we're trying to correct the sound issue here.
Okay, is that better?
That is much better. Thanks, Tina. So there was just a follow-up question. What happens if there is no next of kin?
If there is no next of kin, then you could still fill out the form, but you wouldn't get the entire record. So if you're not the immediate next of kin, then you would get a redacted file. So you wouldn't get the whole thing. If you went and looked at the record in person, so let's say it was a Second World War record, if you went to the National Archives in St. Louis, made your appointment, submitted your paperwork, and went down to view it, you would get the whole unredacted file. But if you request it by mail and you're not next of kin, you would get a redacted file. If there is next of kin who's still living and it's somebody other than you, you could just ask them if they would be willing to apply and put the mailing address care of you, or ask them to give you a copy when it arrives. If you are next of kin, it's free. If you are not next of kin, then there's a fee. And that's spelled out on the form.
Tina, there's one more question, but in the interest of time, we'll just move on. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to that. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so I talked about the fantastic map collections that the Library of Congress has. Here's the link, and it's in your handout of specifically the American Revolutionary map collections that they have. So just again, another phenomenal resource that the Library of Congress makes available to you. Patriot's Path should be the only link in your handout, or only link that's not in your handout. So if you're doing Revolutionary War research and you have ancestors through Tennessee, you might want to jot down this bit.ly link. It's one that has gone live within the last couple of months, and it's a really good resource for physically tracing those Tennessee ancestors who may have served in the Revolutionary War. So it's a great resource. It's the only one, I believe, that's not on your handout if you downloaded it. And then specifics. There are a lot of specific sites, whether you're going to Fort Pulaski or whether you're going to Valley Forge, that has their own record collections as well. I'll talk more about the National Park Service when I talk about the Civil War, but the Valley Forge Muster Roll Project is one of those phenomenal resources that is going to give you copies of, they're going to show you the database of those soldiers who were with General Washington that winter at Valley Forge. So if you've heard family stories and people have talked about having somebody who was there, these muster rolls available through the Valley Forge Museum are a great resource for you. So Heritage Quest, which you have access to from home at any time with your Plainfield Library card, has what's called the American Revolutionary War Pension Files. And these are useful if you don't have access to Fold 3. And I'll come back to Fold 3 in just a second. So when Heritage Quest digitized these Revolutionary War pensions, they did them in black and white. So they're really, really hard to read because you don't have the contrast. So you're talking about, really early, very angular, narrow script that just kind of washes out when they're scanned in black and white. Another downside to the Heritage Quest collection is when they digitize these, they only digitize the pages of the pension file that were pertinent to the military service, not the entire file. So I talk about my Jeremiah Evans. So he's listed in Heritage Quest. His file is 9 pages long. It gives a copy of his last will and testament. It gives information on the unit in which he served during the Revolutionary War, but it doesn't provide any additional information. So I mentioned Fold 3, and the reason why I mentioned Fold 3 is because Fold 3 digitized the exact same collection. And when they digitized their Revolutionary War pension files, they digitized them in grayscale. So they are beautiful. They are easy to read. They are just magnificent. And when Fold 3 digitized these records, they digitized the entire file. So instead of just doing the pages pertinent to the war, they also included anybody who had submitted information to the National Archives asking for information about that soldier. So Jeremiah goes from having 9 pages in Heritage Quest to having 64 pages in Fold 3. He had an ancestor who had written to the National Archives in 1933 looking for information so they could join the DAR. That paperwork is included in the file. They had somebody else who had applied to become a member of the DAR and had contacted the National Archives in the 1970s. That is included in the file as well. So it's really everything, fronts and backs. They're glorious. They really, really are worth it. So if you had utilized Heritage Quest before to look at these records, go back into Fold 3. Our library has a subscription to Fold 3, so you would be able to go through and download the entire file. The downside with Fold 3 is that you have to do it page by page by page. You don't have the ability to just click once and download all 64 pages, but it's really worth the time to do it because the pension files really do have an amazing amount of detail in them. Some other stuff that they have, they've got the Revolutionary War service records. They've got war rolls, which are going to be those muster rolls that are showing you the men in their units with their captains in the command. They have the imprisonment card file. So if somebody was captured by British forces, there's a card file to keep track of those who were prisoners of war, as well as those on the loyalists and British soldiers who were captured. There's a card file for those. And then again, those pension files and those warrants, those land bounty warrants. So one thing to keep in mind is that, and this is in your handout, there was a fire in the U.S. War Department in 1800 that destroyed all pensions that had been filed previous to 1800. So the files that you see are the ones that were either recreated because the person was still alive and continuing to claim their pension, or they're people who had filed after the War Department fire. So don't just assume that there's going to be a pension. They could have collected and then passed away before 1800. So you really want to use some of these other files as well to take a look to see if they're represented in other collections. I am not a big fan of Ancestry Library Edition's Revolutionary War or War of 1812 collections, but they do have some out there available to you. One of the more unique ones are the rejected pensions. Somebody could not verify that they had served long enough, or there wasn't paperwork still in existence to prove that they had served. So they have an index to rejected pensions. All of these live at the National Archives in DC, so you would be able to go, if you find it online, you'd be able to go to the National Archives to view the original. So back to the DAR library. If you've been to the DAR library, you know what it is, what an amazing resource it is, what amazing research materials they have. So they have all 50 states represented, of not just books about patriots, but those descendants as well. So I use the DAR library when I'm in DC, again, to find those women who kind of disappear between, 1780 and the first every name census in 1850. They have a lot of county histories, they have a lot of headstone and tombstone readings, and you can search their card catalog online. So you can see what types of books they have available to you. And if you cannot find it digitally online, you can always send them a request and they can make copies for you and send those to you. So since we're all still sheltering in place and we don't have the ability to go to the DAR library, you can still contact them and ask them to send you materials for a nominal fee. So now the War of 1812 is kind of special to me because the family lore in my family is that I am descended from a person who never served in the War of 1812 at all. He was just unfortunate enough to get captured and thrown on board a ship, during a major battle, and happened to write a little song about it. So supposedly I'm a descendant of Francis Scott Key. We have yet to prove it, but it's something I've spent the last 20 years of my life trying to either prove or disprove. But what's neat about the War of 1812 records is that what the National Archives has and what some individual state archives have are information about not only the soldiers and sailors who served, but about people who contributed to the war effort. So whether that means that, they were a grocer who was feeding troops, or whether they were a farmer who was, giving hay and feed to the horses, anybody who supported the war effort, really, there's paperwork associated for them dealing with the War of 1812. So Fold 3 has some phenomenal collections. This was something that was sponsored by the Federation of Genealogical Societies several years back to really make these collections available through Fold 3 to everybody for free. The prize case, the Southern District Court of New York records are pretty interesting too. Those are, you'll find ships, so British ships that were captured by US frigates, pirates, however you want to call it. You hear about the Barbary Coast, those prize cases are some of those files. They're really, really interesting. I do not like Ancestry's War of 1812 collection at all, especially their soldier index, because it's not done by the name of the soldier, it's done by the name of the captain. And if you have no idea who the captain is, it becomes a really hard collection to manage. But what I would do is I would use Fold 3's collection because it's very, very good. They're digitized. You're looking at the original primary sources. But then on Internet Archives available to you for free, there's a 6-volume index to War of 1812 pensions. And this was published in 1838. So you may have some soldiers who are no longer represented because they've passed away, but it's a great way to find out where soldiers went because it's done by the state that they're currently living in, not the state where they served. So for Illinois, there's a whole page of War of 1812 soldiers listed by the county in which they were currently residing in at the time that they were most recently collecting their pension. So it's a neat index to utilize to take advantage and see if you have a soldier who appears in those records. Why I like that collection more than Ancestry's collection is that this is based off the books that were done in 1838. Ancestry's collection was done in 1955. So the further away you get from the event, the more mistakes and the potential there is for people to misread a document because they don't have first-person primary access to it. They're not familiar with the names. They're not necessarily familiar with the location. So the closer you can get to an event like those Internet Archive records, the more accurate they're going to be. Again, I mentioned the National Archives. You'll see them pop up a lot. They do have a finding aid on their website to teach you a little bit more about the War of 1812. Some other really good sites out there. Family Search has a nice wiki page that's showing you not only what Family Search has, but what's available out there. So they're going to reference Ancestry, they're going to reference Fold3, they're going to reference the National Archives. It's a good starting point to just teach you a little bit about the war and the types of records that were collected. And one of my favorite sites that doesn't really get a lot of love, a lot of people haven't heard of it, is called militaryindexes.com. So whether you're looking for the Korean War, War of 1812, or the Mexican War, there's going to be some type of information available on this website. Again, it's a web portal, it's an aggregator, so it collects other sites and puts them together under military topics. But if I'm looking for a military census of soldiers for the Civil War, this is where I'm going to go to look for those. It's a lot of small historical societies, small library collections that wouldn't necessarily show up in a Google search or wouldn't necessarily show up as being donated to someplace like the Library of Congress or the National Archives. So take a moment when you get a chance and go out to military indexes and see what you can find. So those of us in Illinois may or may not have ancestors who had served in the Black Hawk War. It was very brief. It only lasted about 15 months. There are record collections that exist on the federal level, but largely what you're going to find about the Black Hawk War and then the Mexican War that I'm going to talk about next are really going to fall on the state archives and state libraries. And the reason for that is because these were Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, Indiana militias who were fighting Chief Black Hawk. They didn't have federalized units who were being sent into these locations. So the records that you're going to find are going to be in the Illinois Adjutant General's collection. They're going to be in the Iowa Adjutant General's collections because it's going to be the records that are kept by the Illinois Adjutant General about the Illinois militias that were called up to serve to defend Illinois territory during the Black Hawk War. There's a fantastic website that's done by Wisconsin History that kind of gives you the outline of the Black Hawk War, who the major parties were, how it impacted the settlers, and what the outcomes were. I highly recommend just it's a couple pages long. Read that before you go digging for records because it'll help you understand what exists and where you're going to look for them. Another place to look for Black Hawk War records, the Newberry Library has in the Ayers collection a lot of early settlers' reminiscences. These aren't necessarily digitized, so they don't show up in my handout. But keep in mind the Newberry Library's Ayers collection is going to reference the Black Hawk War. So if you ever find yourself at the Newberry once we're, out and about again, that collection will be one that you might want to target. So you can search online, you can go to newberry.org, you can search the card catalog, see what you can find, but those you'd have to visit in person. But again, National Archives has a couple of things, not a whole lot, but you're really going to go back to Cyberdrive, Illinois. You're going to go to like Wisconsin History and see what's out there and available. Again, Mexican War is the same thing. The Federation of Genealogical Societies is working on indexing and digitizing Mexican War records by going in to the state archives and digitizing these collections. So again, the State Adjutant General is the one who's going to be responsible. There were a couple of units from Southern Illinois who went down to serve, but largely it's Southern states. You're going to be looking in, Alabama, obviously in Texas, in Oklahoma, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, to look for those units who were called up, those militia units for the states who were called up. But Fold3 does have a couple of collections. They've got a very loose index of Mexican-American war service records. This is not complete. I would still go back and check the individual states. Descendants of Mexican War, again, that's one of those service organizations run by the children of the soldiers and veterans who served. So it's not complete. It's compiled from lists of inventories of members who had their own posts set up around the country. And then Family Search has a fairly decent index to Mexican War service records as well. So I would go out to Family Search and take a look at the database that they have put together. As we saw from our poll, the majority of us, a lot of us, have Civil War ancestors. So I hate to call it the big three when you're doing military research, but you've got Revolutionary War, Civil War, and then World War II. Most people have an ancestor or two who fall into those three categories. So there's a lot of information available online for Civil War soldiers and sailors, and not just Union soldiers, but for Confederate soldiers and sailors as well. So if you go to the National Park Service, that's what nps.gov is, the National Park Service has a phenomenal collection of soldiers and sailors service records. If you go to that link, and it's in your handout, it's going to be able to search by soldier's name, search by unit, search by state, and you're going to be able to get an idea right away whether or not you have an ancestor who had served. From there, I would then start digging into some of these other collections. Fold 3 has a huge collection of Civil War research sources available to you. If you're a history buff, you know that Memorial Day was originally Decoration Day. And Decoration Day was founded by General Logan, who was from Illinois, who had decided he wanted to honor and remember the graves of his fallen comrades. So Decoration Day started in 1866 as a holiday to celebrate Union soldiers who had been killed during the Civil War. It wasn't until after the 1930s that it became Memorial Day and memorialized all soldiers. But that tradition, that holiday, started right here in Illinois. And Fold 3 has a fantastic collection, not only on Union Civil War soldiers, but also on the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, what you find on Fold 3 is largely, not exclusively, but largely Union soldiers. There are a couple of Confederate collections that are available in here, but not that many. And there's a very good explanation for that. Fold 3 is taking records directly from the National Archives. So the National Archives wouldn't collect Confederate records because the Confederacy was no longer a member of the United States. They were the Confederate States of America. So they weren't going to be receiving federal funds, and they weren't going to be getting federal help. So while there are a couple of collections in here, one of them is the Amnesty Papers and a Confederate Citizens Files. So if you wanted to become a US citizen again, you had to denounce allegiance to the Confederate States, and you had to swear an oath saying that you would never raise arms against the United States government again. And if that was approved, then you were given amnesty, and there would be paperwork at the National Archives. There were thousands upon thousands of men, some of them who had been US officials, who had been senators and congressmen, who never became American citizens again because they refused to sign the oath. So those records are going to live in the individual state archives, whether it's Virginia, South Carolina, Texas, Missouri, Florida. You're going to look for those records. Georgia has Georgia Vault, which is their state archives website, has Confederate papers digitized and available online. So you're not going to find much on the federal level because they were no longer US citizens. You're going to find them on the state level. There are a bunch of free collections in there. So if you're not a Plainfield card holder and you don't have access to Fold 3 through the library's collection, Matthew Brady's collection, the Abraham Lincoln Assassination Papers, a lot of these are available. Keep an eye out. Fold 3 is going to do a free weekend for Memorial Day. So they're probably going to have their Civil War collection, if not all of their military collections, available for research to use for free coming up sometime within the next couple of weeks. I would be almost certain of it. The Widow's Pension File is ongoing. I haven't checked recently, but they really were at less than 20% because there are probably 1 billion pages of National Archives records that are being digitized to make up this collection. So if you don't see your soldier's pension file or their widow's pension file yet, keep in mind it's going to take them years to complete this project, but you could always go in and take a look and see what's available. Ancestry has a couple of collections as well. They have the US Civil War Soldiers Database and then the Civil War Pension File. A caveat to their Civil War Soldier Database: none of my ancestors are listed in it, and I'll tell you why. So my great-grandfather and his 2 brothers, George Henry and Simeon Middleton, had served from Wisconsin in a Civil War unit. When the war ended, they left Wisconsin and moved to Spirit Lake, Iowa. when the Civil War Soldiers Database was created, it was taken from the county publications that were done after the war. So since they were no longer living in Wisconsin, they were no longer represented in the soldiers from Wisconsin because they had already moved away. So when Ancestry published this collection, they were missing, even though I know all 3 of them served because I have their service records. So if you've gone into this collection and you can't understand why you can't find your ancestor, they might have left the state in which they served and had already moved to another location by the time these names were collected. So don't use that as your primary source for discovering whether they had served. Look at the National Park Service first. Look at Fold 3, look at some state resources. Don't just rely on Ancestry for that information. One more thing I want to add about the National Park Service. If you've ever been to a national parks battlefield, whether that's the Battle of Shiloh, whether that's Valley Forge, whether that's Fort Pulaski, nobody knows that military engagement better than they know that military engagement. If you've ever been to Shiloh and you watch, the maps of the battlefield, or Gettysburg, and you've talked to the National Park Service, they could tell you minute by minute what was going on during that particular engagement. Go to the individual National Park Service webpage for that particular military battle, because they often have more information about what was going on and the people involved than the general National Park Service website. And if you have the opportunity to go and visit in person, a lot of them have their own archives specifically about that battle. I know Gettysburg does, I know Shiloh does, I know Fort Pulaski does. So there's the opportunity to do deeper research once you've looked at what's available online. The records of the claims committees, oh God, I love these records so much. You can find some online through Fold 3. You can find some available. They're starting to be digitized and put into the card catalog to the National Archives. So you basically need to read these with your best Scarlett O'Hara voice, because it was any complaint that somebody had against Union forces or the US government. They swept through my land and burned my fields and took my cows and stole my salted pork. And they would file a complaint to be reimbursed for the money or the land or whatever was lost, whether it was their home or whatever. What's fascinating about these Claims Commission records is that only 40% of them passed, 60% of them were rejected. And they'll have annotations in them that say the US Army wasn't within 100 miles of that particular farm. But it was just people trying to make a claim against the US government. Another caveat to being awarded funds and being reimbursed was that you had to prove that your family had never raised arms against the US government. So you'll see claims where a man will say, oh, well, no, we were always loyal to the Union cause. And then the retort in the record will be, okay, but you had 3 sons who served in the Confederate cavalry. So how does that work? So that's why 60% of these were rejected. And you can find rejected claims on the National Archives. You can find the accepted claims through Fold 3. So other states, like I said, who are going to have really good collections, Illinois has some records online. Missouri really does a fantastic job. So if you go to the Missouri State Archives, there are numerous instances that reference Illinois soldiers, Illinois units, and Illinois camps, because of people being trained in going back and forth over the border. So there's lots of references to Illinois in the Missouri State Archives digitized records. And another thing too is if you moved from Illinois to Kansas City and you died and your family donated your Civil War journal to the Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City, then even though it's an Illinois soldier, you never know where the records are going to wind up. That's why you want to look at some of these collections. Family Tree Magazine has a pretty extensive list of Civil War resources available on their website. So if you went to that link, it would give you about 36 additional sites that you can utilize to dig a little deeper into your Civil War ancestors. I talk about the Sons of the Union Veterans. So there's a collection available on their website of soldiers. There's also the Sons of the Confederacy as well. And in your handout, I give you a lot of Confederate websites that I don't have the time to talk about here today, but it's available for you in the handout. Virginia Tech University has a huge collection of Civil War era newspapers online. The vast majority of these are in the South, so it's a very interesting read to see how the South is perceiving the war of aggression, fighting the war of rebellion versus the what you would read in Northern newspapers. So it's fun to see the difference between the two. And then the Son of the South, even though this is geared largely towards the Confederacy, they have the entire digitized collection of Harper's Weekly newspapers, which did come out of the North. So you're going to have some beautiful illustrations, some really descriptive battle scenes about what was going on during the Civil War. So in Plainfield, you know, we're honored to have Captain McAllister's Battery, the 1st Light Artillery Unit, Company D. They are referenced multiple times in Harper's Weekly, and those are digitized in Son of the South. So the Spanish-American War is one of my favorite wars, just because I have a tendency to abbreviate when I write. And when my boys were little, you know, my son Alex was sitting next to me, and I had abbreviated Spanish-American War, you know, SP, you know, AM for Spanish-American. And my son looks at me, he says, "Mom, why would people fight over Spam?" And I was like, well, duh, because it's delicious. So I had him convinced for a number of years that it was really the Spam War, not the Spanish-American War. But there are some good resources, not as many as you would expect for something like the Civil War or World War I. One of the best websites you could actually utilize would be the Sons of the Spanish-American War. They put together an inventory of the burial locations of most Spanish-American War soldiers. So I was lucky enough to even find my great uncle Gus, because I had absolutely no idea where he was buried. And his grave location in Poplar Bluff, Missouri was listed in here. So it's really, really good resource. I would use them first. I would use Spanish-American War Veterans website second. And then I probably would start looking at what the National Archives has. Spanish-American War gets confused because really the Spanish-American War only lasted 8 months. That's when we think of Remember the Maine, you know, and the US attacking Cuba. The Philippine-American War gets smushed in with the Spanish-American War. That lasted much longer. That lasted for up to 6 years in some locations. So when you're looking for records in this time period, make sure you're looking for the right set of records. Are you truly looking for Spanish-American War records, which are very short-lived, or are you looking for Philippine-American War records? They have a tendency to get smushed together, all listed underneath the Spanish-American War. But if you're striking out and you're not finding what you're looking for, look under Philippine-American War as well and see what types of information you can find. Now, what about people who served outside of an active military engagement? National Archives has a very nice list here of the types of resources and where you would go for them. So remember that cutoff date is 1912. So if you had somebody who served, but they didn't serve during wartime, those records are going to be in Washington, D.C. If they served from 1912 to the present, whether it's wartime or not, or peacetime, those records are in the NPRC in St. Louis. Now there's a gray area, because I have somebody who had served, you know, on the Mexican border chasing Pancho Villa in 1914, and neither the National Archives in DC nor NPRC can find those records. They keep pointing fingers at each other, saying that each other has them. So I have yet to find records for those who are on the border. So you're going to fall into like this little chasm if you happen to have somebody who had served between 1912 and 1914. So just be persistent and check both locations. So now the First World War. I have a slight affinity for the First World War. What's disappointing about the First World War is there aren't as many resources digitized and available online as you would hope. We just have finished celebrating the centennial of the First World War. The U.S. Centennial Commission for World War I has been up and running since 2014. And yet there's still very little to physically show for it. So the collections that you're going to utilize that are going to be most beneficial to you, Ancestry has what's called the U.S. Army Transport Service records from 1910 to 1939. These are in Fold 3. Fold 3s are not indexed. Ancestries are. So in Fold 3, you would need to know the name of the ship and then browse through the microfilm. At least in Ancestry, I could put in my serviceman's name and he would come up. Why these records are important is it's the list of the soldiers that are heading overseas. So if you're not sure if somebody served and was stateside or had gone overseas, this is where you're going to find it. So you'll see two sets of records. So here's my Angus. Isn't he handsome? So I can find Angus going overseas, and I can find Angus returning. So you should see 2 or sometimes even 4 index pages with his name on them. So what it's going to list is it's going to list his name, it's going to list his rank, it's going to list his unit and his service number so that you can request records from the National Archives, and it's going to give you his next of kin. So in case the boat goes down, they know who to contact. But then on the way back, you're going to get that same information. You have to make sure you download both pages because it's very possible that they changed units. He might have gone out as a artilleryman and he might have come back as a machine gunner. So you need to check and see if those are different. As they're returning home, if they're listed as being in a casual unit, it means that they were wounded and in the hospital when the war ended and when they were shipped home. It means that they came back from overseas separate from the rest of their unit. So if you see casual, it doesn't mean they're wearing khakis and Hawaiian shirts. It means that they were separated from their unit because they were in the hospital. Fold 3 has an interesting collection of panoramic unit photos. You know, you've seen those, the 3-foot long fold photos of all the soldiers as they're graduating from basic training. Those are available through Fold 3. If you had somebody who was not a US citizen and had served, because you could be drafted without being a citizen, if they had chosen to become an American citizen, Fold 3 has an index to those naturalizations. And if you were lucky enough to have somebody who had been stranded in Siberia at the end of the war, that were part of the polar bear expedition, those records are at the University of Michigan, and there are some digitized finding aids and some collections available online through the University of Michigan. Also look at other military organizations. So I mentioned the Canadian State Archives here, but then you've got the British Library, you've got the Europeana collections, because when the earliest troops went overseas, they were stationed with British, Australian, and Canadian units. The 2 African-American units, all African-American units, the 269th Harlem Hellcats and the 370th from Illinois were stationed with French units. So they'll be mentioned in those other archives because they had been the ones that had trained them and they had fought side by side. So it's worth it to kind of poke around and see what else might be there. National World War Museum has a phenomenal library and archives. If you find something in their card catalog and it's not already digitized, if you email them, they will digitize it and send it to you at no cost. So World War II, Korea, and Vietnam all kind of fall into the same boat where these are considered modern records. So you're not going to find a lot of things digitized and available online just yet. These soldiers are still alive. These records are still sequestered by the US government. So at the National Archives, records on a 72-year schedule become available. So we only have access to records up to 1958 if we were to go to the archives. So we don't have access to records after 1958. So we don't have Vietnam, we don't have any of the Gulf Wars. Those are still sealed unless you're next of kin. What you'll largely find online are what are called casualty indexes. The word casualty means something very different for the military than what we think of as casualty. Casualty means anybody who is wounded, sick, or dies in battle. So if somebody came down with the German measles, like Mr. Kesich at the beginning of the Second World War, he's listed in the US World War II casualty list because he had been sick and in the hospital. Somebody, you know, gets shot in the foot, they're listed as a casualty even though they survived the war. So these indexes can be a really, really good, useful tool to find out a service number or find out a unit of somebody in your family who had served. Even if they came back and even if they showed no signs of injury or wounds, they might still be listed in these casualty reports. So it's worth it to poke around and take a look. The JAG files are those, they're well, not criminal records, but they're court records. So if somebody had been a witness to a case or had been court-martialed or had been brought up on charges, disorderly conduct, or being AWOL for missing post, they'll show up in these JAG records. Those are indexed and available on Fold 3. Some of those war diaries that I talked about, those clerks' war diaries, not personal letters and diaries. These are those unit histories that I was talking about. And there's a large collection of them on Fold 3, but there's also a collection of them through Internet Archives and the World War II Museum. So I would be checking in both locations for those. There are a lot of Holocaust websites out there. Fold 3 has a collection. I usually wouldn't go to Fold 3 first if I was going to be doing Holocaust research. I would go to either Yad Vashem, I would look at the International Tracing Service, or I would go directly to Jewish Genealogical Society. But each of these are going to be research that you could investigate further if you had people who were captured during the Second World War. They're largely Jews, but you'll also find some Roma, you'll find some political detainees as well that are going to be listed in some of these records. So they're not strictly Jewish, they fall into these collections though. And then at the bottom, I threw this in, it's not in your handout, but if you ever get the chance to go in person to the National Archives and take a look at these collections, they have a collection of German records that were seized when the US troops entered Berlin at the end of the war. And for 10 years, they lived in the US at the National Archives and they were microfilmed. And then those records were turned back over to Germany. There's a finding aid to these collections. There's some really interesting things in here. There are full family trees because in order to become a member of the SS, you had to prove your true Aryan heritage. So there are full genealogies in here. Truly some really interesting, remarkable stuff, but they're not online. Korean War and Vietnam War, again, the same thing. You have these in your handout. Stars and Stripes News in Ancestry that you can search. I believe it's only the Pacific edition. You're not going to get the stateside edition. Those casualty lists that are showing anybody who was wounded or sick or killed. The Navy cruise books, both in Fold 3 and in Ancestry, are worth a look though, because it'll give you, they're like yearbooks for the ships by year. So if you had somebody who was a sailor in 1948, so it's after the Second World War, but before Korea, they're listed in these cruise books, and it gives you a photo of them, it gives you their service number, and it gives you some information about the ship. So the cruise books are really, really fascinating reads if you're lucky enough to have a sailor. The Burroughs list that Fold 3 has is only as good as the information that's provided. So if you would have to have the exact date of death for somebody to make this useful. So if I were to look up, you know, John Evans, there could be 500 John Evanses. The only way I'm going to be able to figure out which one is mine is based on date of birth and date of death, because these don't have any service record numbers or anything. It's just the name, date of birth, and date of death. And then World Vital Records, it's a subscription site. They are offering some free weekends now because of the shelter in place, but they again have those casualty lists that I was talking about that you can find on Ancestry and Fold 3. Vietnam, there's even fewer records available because it's after that 1958 window that the US government makes available. So there's a couple of things on Fold 3, there's a couple of things on Ancestry, but sadly there's really not a lot yet, just because those records are still considered modern and they're still sealed by the federal government. So generic military websites, you have these in your handouts. If you're looking for people who had been killed in action during the Gulf Wars, there's a link in your handout for that. Cindy's list again, American Battle Monuments, which I mentioned during the First World War. Linkpendium is very similar to Cindy's list, but I find it easier to navigate. I don't get lost as quickly. It's done by state and then by county and then by resource. So you can't search for railroad records like you could in Cindy's list unless they fell within a particular county or state, but it's still a great resource. The VA cemetery database is available online. Selective service records you can apply for before 1960. Those are available for you by application to get a copy of somebody's selective service record. Pritzker Military Library in Chicago has some phenomenal resources. They are a lending library, so if you find something at Pritzker, once we're able to request things through interlibrary loan again, you would be able to request those through our library and have them sent here for you. So I will answer questions. I know Kara said there was one other question